Is transubstantiation the historic view of the Christian church concerning the Lord's Supper? That is the question I want to answer today. And if you're unfamiliar with this doctrine, specifically transubstantiation is the doctrine held by the Roman Catholic Church, which says that the bread and wine in the Lord's Supper literally turn into the body and blood of Jesus Christ when you partake of this sacrament. But is this the historic view? Well, let's begin with the church in Acts and the early church, who, for one, were not seeking to answer this question. You see, the early church, they were using the Lord's Supper as instituted by Christ as a time of remembrance of Jesus. It was a time of thanksgivings. It was given at a feast, and they normally used it as a time to bring offerings and gifts to Jesus. Eventually, the Lord's Supper began to be associated with this giving of offerings and thanksgivings and prayers, so it began to develop and be called the Eucharist, which comes from the Greek word meaning thanksgiving. Also, over time, because it was associated with the giving of offerings and giving of sacrificial giving, it became to be known as that the Lord's Supper itself was becoming a sort of sacrifice. It began to be associated with that. So we already have the beginnings of this doctrine of transubstantiation bubbling up in the church. But once we get to the church fathers, we see something very different. You see, in the West, we have church fathers like key church fathers like Origen and Gregory of Nazianzus, who had held to a type of memorialist view, saying that the Lord's Supper was a memorial of the death of Christ. In the East, guys like John of Damascus said that the Lord's Supper was sort of there was a mystical aspect to it, to what was going on there. So neither the West nor the East created this doctrine of transubstantiation. Rather, it became to be known as this doctrine of transformation, where that Lord's Supper transformed into this mystical time where Christ was present. Augustine denied transubstantiation, and he deliberately distinguished between the sign and the thing signified in a letter to Boniface, 98.9. You can check that. And so in the early church, we do not have this doctrine, but later in the 9th century, there were debates between Radbertus and Ratramnus about it. The idea was formulated in the 11th century. It was in the 12th century that we see the word transubstantiation used for the first time, and it was canonized in the Catholic Church at the Fourth Lateran Council in the 13th century. So there you have it. In the early 1200s, the doctrine of transubstantiation became official doctrine of the Catholic Church, and no, it is not the historic position of the Church.